Can you believe what I'm about to tell you? Imagine a place so desolate, so fundamentally hostile to human life, that even the air itself is trying to murder you. Forget the cozy horror movies. This is the reality of the absolute end of the inhabited earth, the frozen, shrieking edge of Patagonia in the year 1600 CE.
This wasn't just cold weather. This was a catastrophe no one saw coming, an environmental Armageddon delivered daily by a force more brutal than any army, the Great Southern Wind. It wasn't a breeze, it was a geological weapon, capable of stripping the flesh from bone and erasing every trace of human existence in a single night. The ice was closing in. The Little Ice Age, that centuries-long global shudder, had reached its savage, merciless peak, and the vast, empty plains of the Patagonian Deep South were becoming an inescapable freezer. Every single breath taken by the nomadic people who called this wasteland home was an act of profound, agonizing defiance. They knew the terrain intimately, yet the land was turning against them, conspiring with the gale to crush their spirits and freeze their blood. This is the story of how a small group of people, armed with nothing but animal hides, bone tools, and a secret knowledge passed down for generations, faced off against the planet's ultimate fury. They lived where no one else could, a testament to human resilience that borders on the mythical. Their challenge was simple and terrifying. Build a haven strong enough to withstand the screaming, perpetual hammer blows of the Patagonian wind, or become frozen statues lost forever to the tundra. The stakes were absolute. Failure meant instantaneous death, swallowed by the white silence. The air temperature itself was irrelevant. It was the wind chill, the relentless, bone-crushing velocity of the air rushing unimpeded from the Antarctic ice sheets, accelerating over thousands of miles of flat steppe, turning moisture to instant, razor-sharp crystal shards. We are talking about gusts that could lift an entire family's meager possessions, tearing their temporary homes, their vital toldos, from the frozen ground and scattering the debris across miles of unforgiving emptiness. This wind didn't just rattle the walls, it attacked the very soul, a constant, high-pitched scream that drove people to the brink of madness. Think about that terrifying, guttural sound echoing across the endless plains, a sound that signaled not just incoming weather, but the potential extinction of your entire lineage. And yet, here they were, the mighty Tehuelche, the resilient Selk'nam, the coastal Kaweskar, masters of an environment that defied survival. They saw the storm coming, but they couldn't run. They had to stand and fight the air itself. Their greatest enemy was not starvation, though that shadow was ever present. It was the insidious, creeping cold that sought out every vulnerable seam in their defenses, every moment of complacency, ready to claim them the second their sacred fire dimmed. Their shelters, these legendary toldos,
These were not mere tents. They were living, breathing fortifications, monuments to applied thermodynamics and sheer human willpower, constructed in a matter of hours from the raw, brutal materials of their kills.
Imagine needing to engineer a structure using only what you can carry, knowing that structure must withstand winds topping 100 miles per hour year after year, protecting infants from temperatures that would shatter stone. It is engineering born of necessity and ancestral genius, a forgotten architectural miracle. The foundation of every toldo was desperation, hardened by experience. They used heavy guanaco hides, painstakingly stitched together with sinew, stretched taut over frames of wood or whalebone, anchored by huge, heavy stones, dragged miles across the frozen ground. The genius lay not in the size, but in the shape. Low-slung, aerodynamic domes that hugged the earth like a limpet, presenting the smallest possible profile to the murderous gale. They understood the physics of wind shear centuries before any modern scientist codified it. But even the most perfectly constructed shelter was a temporary reprieve, a fragile bubble of warmth surrounded by a world that actively hated heat. The constant battle was maintaining the inner environment, keeping the vital flame alive without suffocating the occupants with smoke. Every single hide had to be treated, cured, and sewn with such precision that not a single frozen sliver of wind could pierce the barrier. A single mistake, a tear the size of a thumbnail, could mean hypothermia for the person sleeping nearest the breach. This was life on a knife edge, a constant calculation of risk. If the hunt failed, the materials failed. If the materials failed, the shelter failed. If the shelter failed, the family died. It was a chain of survival forged in the harshest crucible on Earth. And as the winter of 1600 CE descended, bringing with it a deep, terrifying freeze that felt different, heavier, more profound than any before, the people knew they were facing their greatest test yet. They gathered their bone needles and their sinew thread, staring out at the darkening, screaming horizon. The wind was rising. You could hear the change in its pitch. It was no longer just howling. It was screaming their names. The ultimate showdown between man and the elements was about to begin. Deep in the frozen, forgotten plains of Patagonia. Their incredible, secret method of shelter construction was the only thing standing between them and the final, crushing silence of the Antarctic winter. But would it be enough to survive the storm that was barreling toward them? A storm so massive it would be recorded in the geological record for centuries to come. The answer hung suspended in the frozen air, waiting to be delivered by the wind itself. The answer was delivered not by a whisper, but by a catastrophic geological roar. The wind didn't just arrive, it exploded, accelerating from a furious gale to a hypersonic blast in the span of 5 heartbeats. A sound like 10,000 tectonic plates grinding against the granite core of the earth. The air pressure dropped so fast it felt like the very lungs of the world had collapsed in on themselves, and the first blinding shards of ice and snow began their horizontal assault on the steppe. This was not merely weather. This was a war declared by the planet itself. And the scattered bands of the Aonikenk, the southern people, known sometimes as Tewelche, were caught in the zero-sum crossfire, attempting to hold reality together with hide and sinew. The very act of standing became a monumental, muscle-straining calculation, the body leaning into the terrifying vacuum created by the moving air mass. Visibility was instantly reduced to nothingness, a suffocating white fury that erased the horizons and swallowed the mountains whole. They had only moments to complete the final, desperate steps of preparation before the storm reached its true, killing zenith, where the wind speeds could literally lift an unsecured human being and smash them against the unforgiving stone. Far south, near the treacherous strait where two oceans fought perpetual thunderous battles, the people knew this precise scream intimately. Their entire lineage was predicated on reading this terror, on anticipating the exact trajectory of elemental malice and countering it with profound, inherited ingenuity. Their shelters were not built for comfort or aesthetics. They were engineered solely for defiance, designed to channel the wind's destructive multi-ton force harmlessly around a fragile core of life. They needed a sanctuary that could weather the little ice age, a brutal extended winter that had turned Patagonia into a continent-sized weapon pointed straight at their hearts. The foundational architecture of their survival was the tolderia, a mobile dwelling that looked deceptively simple, but contained generations of complex knowledge regarding fluid dynamics and thermal retention. Its structure was a lightweight, portable frame of poles, essential for their nomadic pursuit of the migrating guanaco herds. But the true genius lay in the covering. Massive, meticulously prepared sheets of guanaco hide. These hides, taken from the abundant Patagonian camelid, were stretched, painstakingly scraped clean of all residual flesh, cured using natural fats and smoke, and then sewn together with immense precision using the tough, durable sinew from the animal's legs. The resulting blankets were astonishingly strong, waterproof, and dense, a crucial defense against the penetrating wet cold that characterized the region. When fully deployed, these sewn hides formed a heavy, nearly airtight barrier that weighed hundreds of pounds, requiring the coordinated strength of the entire family unit to maneuver and secure. The process of securing the tolderia against a true Patagonian gale was a terrifying race against extinction. It took synchronized, back-breaking effort, every adult and older child pushing against the monstrous, invisible pressure of the air wall. They didn't merely tie the hides down. They anchored the entire structure with massive field stones, sometimes weighing several hundred pounds each, carefully placed around the perimeter. Furthermore, they would often dig a slight trench around the base and partially bury the edges of the hide walls into the earth itself. This was a critical defensive maneuver, designed to prevent the hurricane-force winds from finding any purchase underneath the structure, which would instantly lift the entire edifice and scatter their possessions and their lives across the frozen expanse. Inside, the noise was beyond comprehension. The wind, which they often personified as a colossal, hungry beast, actively testing the limits of their sanctuary, didn't just blow. It probed, searching for the weakest seam, the loose knot, the moment of human fatigue where the structure might fail. It was a perpetual, violent drumming, punctuated by the terrifying snap of poles flexing to their absolute breaking point, the sound echoing like rifle shots in the dark. The low profile of the tolderia was key. By reducing the exposed surface area, they minimized the force vector the wind could exert, forcing the deadly current to flow up and over their heads. Once the final anchor stone was set, and the entrance flap, another heavily weighted hide secured by wooden toggles, was sealed, the world outside ceased to be visible, replaced by a booming, oppressive darkness. The hides, often layered or reinforced with woven matting, trapped the precious, meager heat generated by the central fire. The hearth, strategically placed in a slight depression near the center, was the pulsing, fragile heart of the camp, fueled by sparse scrub, tough calafate wood, and, critically, carefully dried guanaco or llama dung, which provided a long, slow, reliable burn. Smoke management was an art form in itself. The structures were designed with small, adjustable vents at the apex, allowing the toxic fumes to escape while minimizing the ingress of the killing cold air that could instantly leach the precious warmth. This system required constant monitoring, a silent, tense vigil maintained by an elder, adjusting the vent openings inch by freezing inch to maintain the critical balance between breathable air and survivable temperature. Further south, in the archipelago of Tierra del Fuego, the Selk'nam and Yamana faced an even more relentless, perpetually wet cold, where permanent shelter was impractical. Their solutions were rapid, temporary shelters, cone-shaped huts made of bent branches, quickly covered with thick layers of woven grass, earth, or a few animal skins. These had to be rebuilt constantly, sometimes weekly, a searing testament to the sheer, relentless oppression of the sub-Antarctic environment that demanded endless, agonizing labor simply to exist. As the storm reached its zenith, the reality inside the hide shelter was one of profound, compressed tension. Families huddled together, the warmth of human bodies contributing as much to the survival equation as the engineering genius of the shelter itself. Every sudden, violent gust, every sound of snapping sinew or tearing hide sent a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline through the inhabitants. They were sealed in a dark, booming leather cave, praying that the sinew knots, the massive anchors, and the sheer strength of the cured hides would hold just one more hour, just one more brutal barrage from the elemental fury raging outside. Their incredible ingenuity had bought them a ticket to temporary survival, but the ticket was always fragile, always subject to immediate cancellation by the Patagonian god of the storm. The long, deafening night had begun, and outside, the world was actively trying to forget they ever existed, scraping their memory clean with freezing, unrelenting violence. The very air inside the toldos was thick with defiance, a captured breath held against the throat of the Patagonian winter. Outside, the wind did not just blow, it screamed, a non-Euclidean geometry of sound that warped the very concept of silence, attempting to tear the fabric of reality apart at the seams. Every gust was a heavy, invisible fist slamming into the guanaco hide walls, a relentless hydraulic assault testing the very limits of organic engineering. The storm wasn't just weather, it was a siege, and the inhabitants of these fragile, low-slung structures were the last line of defense for humanity on the bottom edge of the known world.
This was the power of the toldo, not a grand castle of stone, but a masterful, kinetic response to the environment. It was a shelter engineered not to repel, but to absorb and deflect the worst of the elemental rage.
The genius lay in the materials, the hides, scraped and laboriously cured, not just dried stiff, but softened and infused with oil and fat, transforming them into leathery shields that were both tough and surprisingly pliable against the dynamic pressure of the gale. These were the skins of the great guanaco, animals whose very existence was a testament to survival in this brutal landscape, now sacrificed and repurposed into living walls. The sheer volume of material needed to create a single, family-sized structure was staggering. Dozens of hides meticulously stitched together with sinew, overlapped like geological strata, creating an impenetrable thermal barrier against the biting cold of the Little Ice Age. But the hides were just the skin. The skeleton of the toldos was its secret weapon, a framework of massive, curved wooden poles, often sourced from the tough, wind-stunted local beech, nothofagus or similar heart scrub, driven deep into the permafrost-hardened ground.
This was not a simple tent. It was a carefully calibrated, semi-permanent dome, low to the ground to cheat the wind's main line of attack. If the structure stood too tall, the wind would leverage it, snapping the poles like dry bones. Thus, the low, aerodynamic curve was the difference between life and a quick, freezing death. A design wisdom earned through millennia of painful trial and error.
Inside, cross-bracing and internal poles stabilized against the incredible inward pressure, turning the entire shelter into a single, unified, flexible unit that swayed but refused to break. A vessel surviving the ocean of air. The true battle, however, was fought inches above the floor. Even the thickest hides could not stop the insidious seepage of the Patagonian cold, which radiated upward from the frozen earth like a malicious geothermal spirit.
To combat this, the floors were layered not just with hides, but with dense mats of dried grasses, mosses, and even layers of small, insulating pebbles, creating a crucial air gap, a thin, precious cushion of trapped warmth that acted as a thermal break. Every degree gained was a monumental victory against the encroaching 0 point. Central to the existence inside was the carefully managed fire pit. This was not the roaring bonfire of a forest camp. It was a small, smoldering heart, kept low and consuming minimal fuel, constantly tended by the most vigilant elder. The fuel was often the scarce, scrubby brush, or, in the southernmost regions, where wood was utterly non-existent, dried bones packed with fat, burning slow and hot,
to produce steady, essential warmth without generating overwhelming, suffocating smoke.
The smoke hole at the top was not a chimney. It was a meticulously controlled vent, a narrow, cylindrical opening just wide enough to let the worst of the fumes escape, while minimizing the entry of the screaming, murderous cold, a constant adjustment between fire and frost.
Then there was the entrance, the Achilles heel of any shelter. It was always small, always low, forcing those who entered to crawl, and always sealed by multiple overlapping layers of hide, a strategic airlock designed to make anyone entering or exiting pay a heavy toll in maneuvering and swift closing.
To pass through that door was to step across the boundary between existence and erasure. Inside, the atmosphere was a crucible of humanity. Families huddled together, their heavy cloaks of guanaco or fox fur, the formidable quilango, worn constantly, even while sleeping, maximizing the shared thermal envelope.
Every shared breath, every overlapping body was a source of vital energy, a biological battery against the planetary deep freeze. Their diet was their thermal fuel, rich, dense meat, marrow, and vast quantities of rendered animal fat consumed daily.
This fat wasn't just food, it was insulation from the inside out, a physiological defiance of the cold that demanded maximum caloric output just to maintain basic body temperature. Without that internal furnace constantly stoked, survival was impossible. The children, swaddled and nestled deepest in the center, were the focus of the entire communal heat generation strategy, precious anchors in the chaos. Losing a child to the cold was the moment the tribe surrendered to the indifference of the land.
But the storm had hours yet to run, and its intensity seemed only to increase, fueled by the relentless pressure system of the Antarctic vortex, a cosmic engine of destruction. The sound outside was no longer just noise. It was a rhythmic, vibrational attack that threatened to shatter the very morale of the inhabitants.
They could feel the ground shudder beneath them, transferring the titanic force of the gale directly into the structure's foundations. The very poles groaned, a deep, worrying sound that spoke of wood stressed to its breaking point, nearing its elastic limit. Every person inside was hyper-aware of the small, terrifying sound of tearing sinew or the crack of a pole, knowing that a single point of failure could cascade into total structural collapse, exposing them instantaneously to temperatures that froze flesh within minutes.
The wind found weak spots like a predator, probing the seams, whistling through minute gaps with the sound of a mocking, high-pitched laugh. The elders watched the roof hides intently, searching for the telltale shimmer of frost forming inside, the sign that the insulation was failing, and the battle was being lost inch by freezing inch.
The shelter was not safety. It was merely a temporary postponement of annihilation. They waited, suspended in a moment of terrifying equilibrium, knowing that their lives depended on the strength of a few cured hides and the sheer, unyielding will of their ancestors to survive this savage, unforgiving world. The terrifying equilibrium was brief, a whisper before the scream, The wind, which they called Xon, the great deceiver, was testing their geometry, probing for the weak points in the toldo, the great transportable house of hides. It was not just a gale, it was a geological weapon, seeking to exploit the slightest flaw in their ancestral engineering, aiming to peel the roof back like the skin of a slaughtered animal, exposing the vulnerable warmth within to instant, lethal exposure.
They weren't just living in a tent. They were living inside a fortress woven from the very animals they hunted, a symbiotic defiance against the world's most powerful atmospheric weapon. Every seam stitched taut with sinew thread pulled from the legs of the rhea bird was a battle line, a meticulous calculation against capillary action and thermal bleed, against the sheer, overwhelming kinetic force of the storm.
The hides of the mighty guanaco, scraped meticulously thin, yet left with enough subcutaneous fat to repel the sleet, formed the outer shell. These were cured not just to be waterproof, but to be flexible enough to absorb the shock waves of the Patagonian gusts, preventing the sudden, catastrophic tearing that would spell immediate doom for the entire nomadic group. The material science of survival was embedded in their culture. They knew precisely which part of the hide, from which part of the animal, offered the best resistance to shear forces versus the best insulative properties, a knowledge inherited through generations of environmental warfare. The frame itself was another marvel of necessity and nomadic engineering. It couldn't be heavy stone. It had to move with them across the vast, frozen steppe, yet stand against winds that could snap thick timber like dry kindling. The skeleton was built from specific woods, often the lighter yet incredibly resilient calafate, or the heavier nire, selected not for their beauty, but for their specific grain structure and extraordinary resistance to torsion and bending under stress. These woods were their steel. These poles were assembled in a semicircular or dome-like structure, a shape the ancestors knew intuitively distributed the insane pressure of the wind equally across its surface, avoiding the dangerous flat walls that the storm god craved to collapse and destroy. Inside, the community huddled, but even here, the structure demanded constant vigilance and anchoring. They understood ballast inherently. Heavy stones, carried specifically for this purpose across vast distances, a monumental effort in itself, were piled high on the skirt of the hides, fusing the bottom edge of the toldo to the frozen earth. This meticulous sealing created an impervious barrier against the lethal ground draft, the insidious cold current that could creep beneath the structure and chill bodies from the feet up, leading quickly to incapacitating hypothermia. The margin for error was non-existent. The true masters of this existential architecture were the women, the Kawishkad matriarchs, whose hands knew the tension of sinew and the perfect density of hide better than any hunter knew his arrow's trajectory. They were the engineers of insulation, the chief procurement officers for survival. They knew that a single layer of hide was insufficient. Survival demanded layers, a double skin, creating a critical air gap, a primitive but profoundly effective thermal barrier against the exterior world. This was the ancient secret of the vacuum flask applied to human scale. This inner lining, often made of softer, lighter skins, like those of young foxes or smaller deer, trapped the warmth generated by their bodies and their small, meticulously guarded internal fires. This inner chamber was their last line of defense against absolute elemental surrender. The fires themselves were a calculated risk. They used dry wood and nyere bark, carefully controlling the smoke vent, a small adjustable flap at the apex of the dome, a valve regulating life and death. Too open, and the cold rushed in, canceling the heat gain. Too closed, and the smoke would accumulate, suffocating the very lives it was meant to sustain in a lethal, silent cloud. It required a constant, watchful negotiation with the atmosphere. But now the fury was changing tactics. The screaming wind began to subside, replaced by a silence that was far more terrifying. The absolute, heavy silence of geological cold descending upon the earth. The temperature was dropping into the lethal zone. A plunge so rapid it felt like the very air was turning into crystal shards. This was the moment of true peril, when the wind gave way to the deep, penetrating, bone-shattering freeze of the Little Ice Age at its unforgiving southern extreme. The moisture trapped within the hide layers, previously a protective barrier, began to freeze solid, turning the flexible, resilient dome into a brittle, ice-caked shell. If the wind returned now, the structure would not sway, it would shatter like glass, a death sentence delivered by the environment itself. The survival protocols shifted instantly. No longer was the enemy atmospheric pressure. The enemy was conduction, the subtle, insidious theft of heat through every point of contact with the frozen ground and the now ice-stiffened hides. They immediately began the process of re-insulation, piling thick, dried grasses and mosses collected during the warmer months and stored meticulously beneath the floor, between the inner and outer hides, adding yet another layer of organic, desperately needed defense. Their bedding, the precious, thick robes made from layers of sewn guanaco skin, known as kama, became their only true barrier against hypothermia, transforming their sleeping spaces into individual thermal cocoons, where they exchanged body heat like a sacred currency. The central fire had to be augmented, the fuel rationed with mathematical precision. Every adult had a defined task: checking the ballast stones for dangerous ice buildup, rubbing the interior hides with residual animal fat to maintain flexibility, and most crucially, monitoring the youngest members of the group. In this world, a baby's cry was not just distress. It was often the final warning that the ambient temperature had breached the safety zone, signaling the immediate onset of lethal exposure that required instant, concentrated intervention from the entire family unit. Their very survival was a testament to applied, inherited physics, honed over 10,000 years of elemental combat, a defiant warmth burning fiercely against the crushing, indifferent chill of the end of the world. They were not merely enduring the cold, they were actively managing entropy, fighting the fundamental laws of nature with nothing but hide, sinew, and a profound life-saving understanding of Patagonian materials. The silence outside was the sound of the world trying to stop their hearts, but inside the toldo, the low murmur of life persisted, a defiant, beating drum of human ingenuity echoing through the absolute desolation. The howling outside was no longer just air movement. It was the tectonic groan of the world, the voice of the Antarctic deity demanding tribute, trying to rip the very skin from the skeleton of the earth. But here, within the curved, dim sanctuary of the toldo, a miracle of engineering forged from bone, sinew, and brutal necessity was holding fast against the impossible forces of the Patagonian winter. They called it a temporary shelter, but it was a siege weapon, aimed directly at the throat of the gale, a defiant declaration that human life, however fragile, would not be extinguished by the indifference of ice. Its very design was a calculated insult to the wind god, low-slung, oval, and impossibly aerodynamic, sinking its shoulders into the earth to avoid offering the screaming forces a clean surface to grasp and dismantle. The structure was not erected, it was meticulously anchored, relying on a profound understanding of pressure physics. The crucial defense was the exterior armor, layered sheets of thick guanaco hide, prepared through a grueling, weeks-long process of scraping, tanning with natural fats, and smoking until the leather became rigid and water-repellent, impervious to the sleet that fell like frozen shards of glass.
These hides were not merely draped, they were stretched taut over a sophisticated, flexible frame of light, yet immensely resilient, caña coliwe poles, angled sharply inward and lashed at the joints with excruciating tightness using dried animal sinew. This complex lattice acted like a massive inverted suspension bridge, distributing the colossal lateral pressure of the jet stream across the entire dome instead of concentrating it on a single vulnerable point.
Every single seam, every meticulous stitch executed by the quick, powerful hands of the women represented centuries of inherited architectural knowledge, a precise, unwritten science of material stress and thermal dynamics that modern engineers would still marvel at. They understood that in this climate, a gap the width of a thumb was a fatal flaw, a thermal breach through which death would quickly infiltrate and claim the sleeping inhabitants. The floor was always excavated slightly below the natural ground level, creating a crucial earth bank around the perimeter, a thermal moat that prevented the permafrost from creeping in and stealing the precious accumulated warmth. This slight depression also served to block the ground-level drafts, the sneaky, serpentine fingers of the cold seeking purchase beneath the hide skirts. The central fire pit, the hearth that served as the beating heart of this fortress, was not permitted to burn large or fiercely, which would consume their scarce wood too rapidly and demand too much oxygen. Instead, it was fiercely efficient, burning low quantities of dry scrub, scavenged roots, and pulverized bone mixed with melted animal fat, generating just enough radiant heat to warm the breathing space immediately surrounding the sleepers. But fire, the genesis of their survival, had a deadly cost: smoke. Without proper management, the resulting fumes would bank low, stealing the oxygen and delivering a slow, silent death through carbon monoxide poisoning. The ingenious system of smoke flaps, adjustable openings at the apex of the high dome, required constant, vigilant manipulation by the designated watchman. Too open, and the blizzard would tear the roof to shreds and extinguish the life-giving flame, freezing them within hours. Too closed, and the invisible poison would rise from the embers. It was a terrifying, continuous balancing act, a knife-edge walk between suffocation and freezing, demanding perfect attention through the darkest, coldest hours of the night cycle. Inside the toldo, amidst the ordered chaos, the world was ritualized order in defiance of the external mayhem. The elders, their eyes perpetually narrowed from decades of fierce Patagonian sun and snow glare, monitored the structural integrity of the main supports, listening for the telltale ominous creak that signaled a bull failure under the unimaginable weight of the ice and wind pressure. The women worked tirelessly, their hands never still, constantly mending and patching the interior with tightly woven mats made from tough grasses and meticulously prepared furs, creating a final, critical layer of insulation that trapped the rising thermal energy. Every breath exhaled was a finite, conserved resource, recycled and reused within this microscopic, fiercely defended biome of survival. Then, cutting through the monotonous roar of the wind, came the sound that instantly galvanized every person inside, a noise that made the blood run instantly cold. Not the howl, but a deep, vibrating, low-frequency thrum. The extreme pressure differential between the roaring atmosphere outside and the pressurized air pocket inside was causing the thick guanaco hide roof to resonate like a vast, primitive, over-tightened drum skin. It was the sound of the atmosphere attempting to crush them flat, to implode their entire world and turn the shelter into a pancake of collapsed hide and broken bone. This meant the wind had abruptly shifted, hitting the narrow, traditionally less protected end of the structure with the full, unfiltered, concentrated force of the glacial plains, increasing the stress exponentially. A young hunter, designated as the wind listener due to his unnervingly acute hearing, scrambled instantly to the downwind side, grabbing a handful of sharpened bone pegs tethered to thick, braided sinew lines. His task was suicidal in its immediacy: to quickly adjust the external guy lines, redistributing the new, devastating pressure across the entire frame before the weakest point, the main arch pole, buckled and initiated a catastrophic structural failure. He knew the penalty for failure was immediate demolition and the exposure of his entire extended family unit to instantaneous freezing. But the penalty for even a moment of hesitation was the certain, swift death of every soul inside. With a silent, desperate prayer to the ancestors of the earth, he thrust open the hide entrance flap, tearing the barrier,
and stepping into the elemental maelstrom, where the wind instantly tried to rip the clothes from his body and turn his flesh into frozen dust. The moment the flap opened, the internal, precious thermal heat instantly plummeted, an audible collective gasp escaping the occupants as the warm air rushed out and the predatory cold surged inward like a physical entity. The shelter was compromised, the seal broken, and the clock was ticking down to 0 until the wind either relented or swallowed them whole. The true battle for the next hour had just begun, waged by one brave soul against the raw fury of the planet.
Karuk was not fighting air. He was fighting a solid geological wave. The wind slammed into him, a horizontal fist of ice that stole breath and threatened to rip his very soul from his body. Every muscle screamed in protest, but the sound was drowned out by the apocalyptic shriek of the southern gale.
He knew this sound, the whisper of the white death, the moment the temperature dropped past the point of return and the atmosphere itself began to solidify into a killer. His hands, though calloused by a lifetime spent navigating the jagged edges of the world, were already turning the waxy white of deep tissue freeze, sacrificing sensation for survival. The immediate goal was stabilization. The main structural poles, carved from hardy lenga wood and meticulously secured, were holding, but the heavy guanaco hide curtain, the final impermeable skin of their refuge, was flapping like the sail of a doomed ghost ship.
That hide, tanned over weeks with rendered animal fats and treated with ancient oils to repel the relentless sleet, was the only thing standing between his family and utter oblivion. Karuk needed weight, not just any weight, but the colossal, smooth river stones they had painstakingly carried from the valley floor days ago, knowing this exact moment of reckoning would arrive. These stones, each the size of a man's torso, were the anchors of civilization in a land that hated stability. He crawled rather than walked, leveraging his low center of gravity against the wind's murderous lift, his body a living counterweight against the sheer force trying to lift him into the sky. He reached the first stone, its surface already slick with rime ice, and fought the agonizing stiffness in his fingers to secure the thick sinew rope around it. The wind howled a challenge, striking the hide wall with such force that the entire frame shifted, causing a terrifying low groan from the main support beam inside. It was the sound of a ship breaking apart on unseen shoals, and the people inside knew what that sound meant. Failure here meant rapid, certain exposure, and death within the next 60 minutes. Inside, the few remaining embers in the central hearth flickered wildly, dancing to the rhythm of the near-gale pressure changes as Karuk struggled against the atmospheric pressure differential.
The children were huddled beneath layers of shared fur, their small breaths creating the only moisture in the arid, cold air. Their entire existence now a silent prayer to the ancestors of the wind. Karuk's wife, Yamana, watched the hide door tremble, knowing that the structural integrity of their entire world depended solely on her husband's singular focus and rapidly failing strength. She had seen men break under far less pressure. The Patagonian wind didn't just kill the body. It sought to shatter the will first, whispering impossible promises of warmth, if only they would just surrender the fight. But Karuk was performing a feat of geotechnical brilliance under duress. He wasn't simply piling rocks. He was strategically placing ballast to counter the wind's specific, generationally refined counterforce, calculated from watching how the southern viento tried to peel the earth away from its core.
He had to ensure the rope running from the base of the central pole through a reinforced eyelet in the hide pulled the stone inward, creating tension that maximized the friction against the frozen ground. If the angle was wrong by even a single degree, the stone would simply slide away under the immense leverage of the wind, and the atmosphere would peel the hide back like fruit skin, exposing the soft interior to the Arctic shockwave. The second stone was secured. The third was a brutal test of endurance, requiring him to lift and drag while fighting the urge to simply lie down and let the blessed, painless sleep of hypothermia take hold. His lungs felt like shards of shattered glass, and his vision tunneled into a blinding white periphery as the cold radiated up through the earth itself, pulling the residual heat from his knees and forearms. This wasn't merely freezing air. This was the geological cold of the Little Ice Age, a weapon wielded by the planet against all temporary life forms daring to exist in its domain. He gritted his teeth, pulling the final, massive anchor, the one protecting the most vulnerable corner, into position just as the wind gathered itself for its most devastating attack yet. A true, focused atmospheric punch that rattled the teeth in his skull and vibrated the very stones of the ground. Crack. A terrifying sound echoed, not of the structure failing, but of the wind momentarily breaking the sound barrier as it funneled through the narrow space between the hide and the bedrock. The lenga pole groaned. The hide tightened to the firmness of stretched drums, and then slowly, miraculously, the structure held its breath. The 4 anchors were perfectly set. The shelter was locked into the dying earth. Karuk used the last vestiges of his strength to shove the heavy, reinforced hide flap back into position, sealing himself inside the sudden, relative silence of their makeshift bunker. He collapsed immediately upon the floor of shared furs. The transition from minus 50 degrees wind chill to merely below zero air, feeling like a furnace blast against his deadened skin. The danger outside was momentarily neutralized, but the internal battle, the urgent, desperate fight to bring his core body temperature back from the absolute brink of extinction, had just begun. The battle inside was far more insidious than the screaming wind he had just escaped. Hypothermia, the silent, geological assassin, was settling its icy grip deep into the marrow of Cooch's bones, slowing his heart, dulling his vision. He knew the drill: move or become a statue of frozen flesh, every muscle fiber screaming in protest, locked rigid by the temperature drop that had stolen the precious central warmth
needed for life itself. His fingers, slick and numb, were clumsy instruments, incapable of fine manipulation. Yet this was the most vulnerable moment, the critical juncture where the human spirit often surrendered to the elements. But surrender was not in the Tehuelche lexicon. Survival was encoded in the very DNA of these southernmost survivors, demanding immediate, focused action. He had to reach the fire kit, the sacred bundle of dry tinder, before the darkness claimed his mind entirely.
He fumbled for the pouch tucked high beneath the layers of guanaco hide, a priceless treasure meticulously protected from the constant dampness of the Patagonian air that seeped into everything, rotting material and ambition alike. Inside lay the key to life, the fire drill, crafted from tough calafate wood, and, most importantly, the yesca, a compacted ball of dried moss and finely shredded grass, rendered waterproof with fat and wrapped tightly in bladder membrane.
This wasn't just kindling. It was stored solar energy, meticulously hoarded during the few fleeting months of summer, a lifeline against the relentless, planet-killing winter that held them captive. The true genius lay not just in starting the flame, but in sustaining it, demanding specialized knowledge passed down through generations who battled the ice.
Cooch positioned the small, concave hearthstone, selecting the driest slivers of bark he had managed to collect near the shelter's entrance, fuel that burned fast and fierce to establish the critical initial heat. With agonizing effort, he braced the bow drill against his thigh, his breath clouding heavily in the still, frigid air of the toldos interior. The effort alone threatened to send him crashing back into the black void of exhaustion.
The friction began, a rhythmic, desperate sawing motion that demanded immense, focused energy Cooch barely possessed. The whine of wood against wood was the only sound, a high-pitched prayer against the relentless roar of the outer gale, which sounded like 1,000 starving wolves trying to tear the hide walls down. Smoke, thin and acrid, began to rise, a promise of warmth, but also a danger if not managed properly within the confined space.
He pressed harder, ignoring the fiery ache in his shoulder, willing the tiny ember, the seed of salvation, to ignite, fighting the neurological shutdown that made his movements jerky and unreliable. Finally, a speck of red, impossibly small, bloomed at the base of the drill, a microscopic victory against the macrocosm of cold. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return.
He carefully transferred the ember to the waiting yesca, cupping it with hands that trembled violently, shielding the fragile heat source from the slightest errant draft. Cooch lowered his head, breathing gently, steadily, nurturing the fragile heat into a viable flame. His entire world focused on that single glowing spot.
He blew shallow breaths at first, then deeper, coaxing the moss to catch until a plume of golden light erupted, banishing the worst of the deep interior shadows. The smell of burning fat and dry grass filled the space, the sweet, metallic perfume of defiance. He had won the first round against the absolute, sterilizing frost.
Now came the engineering marvel of the shelter itself, the structure designed around this very moment of crisis. The fire was strategically placed in a shallow depression in the center of the earthen floor, the designated hearth, a feature often lined with flat stones if available, designed to radiate heat outward and upward, minimizing lateral heat loss through the floor. Above it, woven subtly into the high dome of the leather and pole structure, was the cochito, the tiny, essential smoke vent, a brilliant piece of environmental architecture. This vent was not simply a hole, it was a calibrated breach in the thermal barrier, designed to allow noxious gases to escape while retaining the maximum possible warmth. Too large, and the gale would rip through the shelter, pulling the precious heat away like a cosmic vacuum cleaner. Too small, and the smoke would suffocate the inhabitants in their sleep. It was a precise balance, calculated over millennia of observational meteorology, perfected by ancestors who treated every cubic inch of space as a sacred, finite resource, guarded by their lives. The primary structure, the famed toldos of the nomadic Tehuelche, was inherently aerodynamic, its low, sloping profile shrugging off the infamous Patagonian blasts that could snap mature trees like brittle kindling, distributing the pressure evenly over the curved surface. But its true defense lay in its cladding. These weren't mere skins. They were layers of meticulously prepared guanaco and puma hides, scraped thin, treated with fat, and stitched together with sinew, overlapped like geological strata, creating a robust, multi-layered thermal mass that defied the physics of freezing. The external hide became almost rigid with ice, creating an insulating shell of frozen air and leather. As the fire grew, throwing leaping shadows against the curved hide walls, Cooch began the slow, agonizing process of rewarming his frozen limbs, pressing his hands close to the flame, careful not to burn the damaged, still numb tissue. He was grateful he was currently alone, allowing him to monopolize the heat. But he knew true survival required the collective and the power of shared warmth. Later, when his family returned, the combined body heat of several individuals would dramatically raise the ambient temperature within the tiny, insulated space, sometimes by 10 degrees or more, a critical differential between agonizing survival and sudden, peaceful death. Furthermore, the fire would be carefully managed, banked for the night, using slow-burning bone or dried manure mixed with clay. This was a fuel source that offered steady, long-lasting, low-intensity heat without rapid consumption of precious wood, which was desperately scarce on the high steppes. This was the genius of their existence. They didn't just survive the cold. They engineered microclimates of absolute defiance. They turned the lethal vacuum of the Little Ice Age into a bearable, if fiercely contested, territory. The shelter was not just refuge, it was a warm-blooded, highly efficient machine, and the fire was its beating, essential heart, demanding constant vigilance and respect. The wind shrieked outside. A frustrated predator denied its prey. But inside the toldos, Cooch finally began to feel the terrifying rigidity melt away, replaced by the deep, profound, luxurious ache of returning life, a victory claimed, one molecule of heat at a time.
The silence inside the toldo was not the silence of peace, but the muffled roar of a planet trying to kill them, a sound proved by layers of hides stitched with bone needles and bound by generational knowledge. Cooch's breathing finally evened out, but his mind raced, cataloging the sheer, impossible weight of the survival engineering that encased him. This wasn't merely a tent. It was a pressurized chamber of defiance against the elemental laws of thermodynamics, a fortress built entirely of stolen heat, an island of biological warmth in an ocean of absolute zero.
Every muscle fiber in his body understood that the moment they stepped outside, the air would instantly become liquid razor wire, slicing away the precious energy they had fought a geologic war to obtain, demanding immediate payment in hypothermia and death. The heat radiating from the small central fire pit, fueled by painstakingly gathered near wood and dried brush, was the pulse of the entire micro-civilization, and if that pulse faltered, the end would be swift and total, leaving only frozen statues where humans once stood.
The Tehuelche had mastered the art of mobility and resilience, creating a structure that was both temporary and permanent, capable of being erected and dismantled within an hour, yet strong enough to withstand gales that could snap ancient trees. The secret to the toldo's success lay not just in material, but in its perfect aerodynamic shape and orientation, built specifically for catastrophic wind loads. Unlike the circular or dome-shaped huts of other indigenous groups, the Patagonian dwelling was a semi-conical, rectangular beast, always positioned with its massive, slanting back, facing the relentless Patagonian west wind, the dreadful viento blanco that descended from the Andes like a geological battering ram. The design was a calculated compromise between minimizing surface area exposed to the worst force and maximizing the internal space necessary for a large extended family unit to survive the months of siege.
The structural skeleton was the key. Heavy wooden poles, often made from the incredibly resistant wood of the calafate or lengua trees found along the river edges, were driven deep into the frozen earth and then secured externally with massive anchor-like stones and heavy leather thongs. These formed the robust, unyielding frame, but the true genius was the cladding, the multi-layered skin.
Imagine layer upon layer of guanaco hides, the very definition of natural insulation, painstakingly scraped free of residual fat and membrane, treated with natural oils for maximum water resistance, and then meticulously stitched together using sinew so tough it was stronger than any modern composite fiber. These hides, sometimes stacked 3 and 4 deep on the windward side, created crucial air pockets, dead air spaces that functioned as a powerful insulation buffer, vital for retaining the radiated heat from the internal hearth.
It was bio-insulation perfected over millennia, transforming the skin of one animal into the necessary skin of another. The human species demanding survival against the planet's fury. Inside, the space was highly organized, driven by the cold, unforgiving logic of efficiency, where every inch had a purpose and every movement was minimized
to conserve caloric energy. The ground was never left bare. It was lined with thick layers of dried grasses, moss, and more hides, preventing the cold earth from acting as an enormous, silent heat sink, sucking the life straight out of their feet and pulling the fire's output downward. Every individual had their designated sleeping area, positioned optimally in tight proximity to share body heat, minimizing the exposed surface area to the ambient, freezing air that inevitably seeped through any imperfection in the structure.
This wasn't just comfort. It was complex, communal thermodynamics in action, practiced by people who measured the cost of survival in degrees, not currency. The entrance, typically low and covered by a heavy, overlapping flap of hide that sealed tightly against the frame, was a critical point, a portal between worlds.
Opening it meant a terrifying rush of outside air, a momentary betrayal of the sanctuary, a calculation only undertaken when absolutely necessary for fetching water or relieving themselves. Every time someone slipped out to check the heavy tether ropes that secured the toldo against the increasing western gale, or to replenish the meager fuel supply, they risked losing 10 minutes of accumulated heat, a debt the entire community had to repay with shivering silence and concentrated warmth.
The true architects and maintainers of this miraculous survival system were the women. The procurement and preparation of the hides was an epic, continuous, grueling marathon of scraping, stretching, and stitching that demanded incredible physical endurance in conditions that would paralyze an outsider. A single large toldo could require the hides of perhaps 50 guanacos, meaning 50 individual battles against decay and rigidity. 50 hours of careful, precise work to ensure a waterproof, airtight seal.
If a seam failed, even by an inch, the pressurized wind found its way in, bringing localized freezing and rapid heat loss, and the sanctuary failed. The bone needles, sharpened meticulously and treated as sacred tools, passed down through mothers and daughters, pierced the leather, drawing the tough guanaco sinew through, binding life to life.
This sinew was the fiber of their civilization, flexible, incredibly strong when wet, and the ultimate guarantor against the elemental siege. This was the hidden war waged constantly, the slow, repetitive, demanding work of keeping the fortress intact against the constant, microscopic attrition of the environment. The men hunted and fought the immediate threats outside. The women ensured there was a structure to return to, a place where life could persist, anchored by their invisible labor.
The air inside the toldo was thick, pungent, and absolutely intoxicating to the survivors. It was a complex aroma of smoked hides, rendered animal fat used for light and heating. The air inside the toldo was thick, pungent, and absolutely intoxicating to the survivors. It was a complex aroma of smoked hides, rendered animal fat used for light and heating, dried meat, and the vital, warm exhalation of human breath, the smell of defiance itself. The smoke hole at the peak, perfectly sized and carefully controlled with an adjustable vent, allowed just enough exhaust to escape without letting the monstrous chill drop down like an executioner's axe onto the sleeping bodies. The fire itself was a masterpiece of control and economy. They rarely burned large, roaring bonfires that wasted energy, drawing in too much cold air and requiring exorbitant amounts of fuel. Instead, they maintained a deep, smoldering bed of embers, constantly nursing the heat source, allowing it to radiate warmth steadily and economically, like a geological heating system. This discipline was non-negotiable. To waste fuel was to steal minutes from the collective future. To let the fire die was to accept annihilation. As Cooch lay there, finally reaching core temperature, the subtle, flickering glow cast moving shadows on the taut hide walls, making the material less like animal skin, but more like the very membranes separating human existence from the endless, absolute dark.